Hello everyone, a very good morning and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to the daily Hindu news analysis. So let's begin the discussion by first taking a look at the topics we have chosen for today's analysis. Today in the newspaper we have very few articles actually which are relevant for the exam, and I have chosen three important articles for a detailed discussion. Apart from that, we have two small articles which are more prelims oriented. So these are the five articles we are going to discuss today. And before we begin, don't forget to express your support by pressing the like button. And once the session ends, do share your comments and do share the video with other aspirants as well. And also don't forget, after the session, we have a quiz on our Telegram channel. So do head to the Telegram channel after the session so you can practice these questions and revise these articles again. So with this, let's begin with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper. We have this article on page number 6 of the Delhi edition written by Rajiv Bhatia. Rajiv Bhatia is a former Indian diplomat who has also served as an Indian ambassador. And in this column, he is talking about the centrality of ASEAN grouping for the Indo-Pacific region. The entire discussion is focused on this grouping called ASEAN, and he is highlighting the issues being faced within the ASEAN group. He is pointing out how there are differences within ASEAN which has affected the unity within the grouping, and that affects the centrality of the group as far as Indo-Pacific region is concerned. This is the essence of the argument that the writer is making. So let's dive deep into this topic. First, let's understand what is ASEAN. Let me give out some basic facts for your prelims. Let's understand what equation does India have with ASEAN grouping. And then let's take a quick look at what the writer is talking about. ASEAN stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations. I'll repeat, ASEAN stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Essentially, it is a regional grouping of 10 Southeast Asian countries. 10 Southeast Asian countries, that is Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei and Philippines. These 10 Southeast Asian countries are part of this grouping, which is essentially a political, economic, security-based grouping. This grouping promotes close political ties between the members. It has also created a common market through a free trade arrangement. These 10 Southeast Asian countries have created a free trade area amongst themselves, providing for the free movement of goods and people and investments. They also focus on security issues, cultural cooperation, etc. This is the primary focus of ASEAN grouping: building close political ties, maintaining close economic relations through a common market and maintaining economic unity, and promoting socio-cultural unity within the Southeast Asian community. So as a result, ASEAN becomes a very, very important group for the region. This group was established in 1967 with the signing of the Bangkok Declaration. Is that clear? The Bangkok Declaration led to the establishment of the ASEAN group. So over the decades, ASEAN has become one of the most prominent regional groupings in the world. And it has not only brought the 10 Southeast Asian countries together, but it has also cemented Southeast Asia's position as a central region to the Indo-Pacific. As you know, today the global focal point of geopolitics and economic activities is the Indo-Pacific. The entire stretch of Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean is the focus point of global geopolitics and economic growth. In this Indo-Pacific region, Southeast Asia is at the very center of it. Not just geographically, but because of the prominence of ASEAN and how these 10 countries work unitedly. That is what makes ASEAN the central pillar of the Indo-Pacific region. So ASEAN countries use this influence that they have to bring many other countries together from the entire Indo-Pacific to ensure that the Indo-Pacific region is stable. For example, ASEAN Group has established ASEAN Regional Forum in order to work closely with various powers which are critical to Southeast Asia and the Indo-Pacific. Around 27 countries are brought together by the ASEAN Group under ASEAN Regional Forum. ASEAN is also central to the East Asia Summit. The East Asia Summit, which happens to be one of the key platforms of the Indo-Pacific. This includes the 10 ASEAN countries at the center, along with the major powers of Indo-Pacific like India, China, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, US and Russia. All these countries, along with the 10 ASEAN countries, come together to form the East Asia Summit. In fact, these countries also have a defense ministers meeting called ADMM Plus, ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus. The 10 defense ministers of ASEAN come together under the platform, and they also invite the defense ministers of all these countries, essentially all the major powers of Indo-Pacific. So ADMM Plus focuses on maritime security and security related issues of the Indo-Pacific, including counter-terrorism and organized crime. So ASEAN is giving leadership to such important groupings that are focused on Indo-Pacific and specifically on Southeast Asia. So this is what establishes the centrality of ASEAN Group. Now India has established extremely close relations with this organization. Starting from 1991-1992, when India launched the Look East policy under the then Narasimha Rao government, India started maintaining very close ties with ASEAN. Because the focus of Look East policy that was launched in 91-92 was to pay attention to the eastern region to ensure that India would find new partners and new friends and new markets and also drive new investments towards India. So under the Look East policy, the top priority was to establish strong ties with the ASEAN Group and the Southeast Asian countries. Now this policy has been upgraded by the Modi government, and it's known as the Act East policy since 2014. Even under the Act East policy, the top priority of India is the ASEAN Group. India's ties with ASEAN is central to the Look East Act East policy of India. So over the last 3 decades, under the Look East and Act East policy, India has established very close ties in the political domain, economic domain, and even in the security and cultural domain. India has not only signed a free trade agreement with ASEAN, which has provided for free movement of goods, services and investments, but India also has established strategic relations focusing on defense and security with some of the ASEAN countries. For example, India has very close defense relations with Vietnam. India even supplies defense components to Vietnam, and recently we have gifted a naval vessel, INS Kirpan, to Vietnam. India also has signed an agreement with Philippines to export the BrahMos cruise missile. India works very closely with Indonesia, Singapore and Thailand, and we have military exercises with all these Southeast Asian countries. In fact, Singapore's Air Force and Navy, they use Indian military facilities for training due to shortage of space in Singapore. So that is the kind of close defense and security relations that India has built with the ASEAN countries. So along with close political and economic relations, India has also focused upon close security ties and as well as close cultural and people-to-people relations. Today, Southeast Asia is a major market for India. Indian exports find a huge market in Southeast Asian countries. We also source critical ingredients, raw materials from Southeast Asia, which is crucial for our domestic production. And Southeast Asia is also a source of investments, particularly Singapore, which is a global financial hub, drives a lot of foreign direct investment, FDI, into India. So that is the close relationship that India shares with ASEAN. India understands that ASEAN is central to the Indo-Pacific. Now the writer is mainly focused on the recent issues and differences that have come up within the ASEAN organization. The writer is worried that these differences will affect the unity of the group, and if unity of ASEAN is compromised due to these internal differences, this will erode the centrality of ASEAN as far as the Indo-Pacific region is concerned. That is the core argument that the writer is making. The writer says that within ASEAN there are some internal differences between the member countries. These differences are weakening the unity of the group, and if the unity of ASEAN is weakened, then it erodes the centrality of ASEAN in the Indo-Pacific. Is that clear? The writer is worried about the stand of ASEAN countries over the ongoing situation in Myanmar. I hope you guys know that since 2021, Myanmar has been going through a political crisis. Myanmar's military junta dismissed the electoral process throughout the government, suspended the democratic process, and has captured power again in the country. It has imposed an emergency and violated democratic rights, and since then it has targeted pro-democracy protesters and carried out large-scale human rights violations as well. So this volatility, destabilization in Myanmar is not just a concern for India, it's a major concern for ASEAN group, because Myanmar is a key Southeast Asian country. It's a key member of ASEAN grouping. So to resolve this crisis in Myanmar, ASEAN had proposed a 5-point consensus in 2021. When the crisis broke out and when it started having an impact in the region, ASEAN countries proposed a solution called 5-point consensus to help resolve the crisis. The solution was to call for a ceasefire, to ensure that Myanmar's military will not target civilians, to restore political dialogue, bring back normalcy, and ensure that the affected people are rehabilitated. So this approach was proposed by ASEAN countries, but due to differences within ASEAN, 5-point consensus was never implemented. The 5-point consensus was not implemented because Myanmar rejected it, and due to internal differences within the group, Myanmar got some support. For example, Thailand supported Myanmar indirectly. Is that clear? See, Thailand itself is going through an internal crisis as we speak. In Thailand, the royal elites and the military have constantly undermined the pro-democracy movement, and in the recent elections as well, Thailand's military also has tried to consolidate its power at the cost of democracy and human rights. So Thailand itself is a question mark when it comes to democracy. And Thailand has backed Myanmar, and it did not allow the implementation of 5-point consensus. The other challenge here is the role of China in Southeast Asia. China is a dominant, significant power in the region, and it is very, very close to few countries, particularly Myanmar, Laos, and Cambodia. These ASEAN members are very close allies of China. They are almost virtual dependencies of China. These three countries, which are also communist countries, they are heavily dependent on China for support. So on every issue, they directly support China. Blindly, they give support to China. Thailand as well sometimes is seen to be either neutral or indirectly backing China and Myanmar's military regime. This is a major internal difference. Whereas others like Indonesia, Singapore, and other countries were trying to push for a peaceful settlement through 5-point consensus, but others did not support the position, thereby perpetuating the crisis in Myanmar. The role of China and the rising competition between US and China is another major internal divide within ASEAN group. As I told you, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, they are firmly aligned with China. Thailand also appears to be on the side of China. But there are few countries like Philippines and even Vietnam to an extent. which aligned more closely with the US, mainly because of the South China Sea dispute, which is a major concern for Vietnam and Philippines as far as China is concerned. Because China has been extremely aggressive. It has even resorted to violent military measures to threaten Philippines and Vietnam over the South China Sea dispute. China has claimed the Paracel Islands, the Spratly Islands, and the Scarborough Shoal entirely for itself in the South China Sea, which threatens the claims of these countries like Vietnam, Philippines, and the others. China is in direct violation of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, and hence Philippines and Vietnam are in direct confrontation with China. So they are more closer to the US, particularly Philippines is very close to the US, gets diplomatic military support from the US, and this leads to an internal divide amongst the ASEAN members. Many ASEAN countries are so heavily dependent on China that some of them actually become neutral on these issues. Countries like Singapore, Malaysia, and even Indonesia. These ASEAN members, they often don't take a stand on the South China Sea issue. They don't push China back for its aggression and for its breakage of international rules, because they have a great deal of dependency on China, so they often take a middle ground. Even though Singapore is a close US ally and it has very close military relations with the United States, it refuses to take a firm stand on the South China Sea dispute, and it does not directly support Philippines and Vietnam because these other countries are worried about China's retaliation. Because many of the Southeast Asian countries have a lot of economic dependency on China. They're dependent on China's produce and goods that enter the Southeast Asian market. They're dependent on Chinese investments, on China's tourism. Chinese tourists who come to the region are a major source of revenue. So China has this hold and influence on many of these countries, which has internally divided the group. The US also has tried increasing these divisions by creating its own allies in Southeast Asia, and as a result, ASEAN as a group has become more divided. Is that clear? So these are the major concerns that the writer is bringing out. The writer says that ASEAN has brought out the ASEAN Outlook for Indo-Pacific. ASEAN Outlook for Indo-Pacific. This is ASEAN's vision for the Indo-Pacific region. This is based on 4 major pillars, which includes maritime cooperation, connectivity, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, and promoting economic cooperation in the region. These are the 4 pillars identified by ASEAN countries under ASEAN Outlook for Indo-Pacific. This is ASEAN's vision for the Indo-Pacific region. Now this vision aligns with the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative of India. Now that is why these developments are of concern to India. First of all, we have very close ties with ASEAN, as I explained. We have close security relations, economic relations, and India has made very big investments as well in the region. So India also is equally interested in the Indo-Pacific to counter the rise of China, to protect Indian interests, and even to take a stand on the South China Sea dispute. So India would like to work with these like-minded countries like Japan, Australia, or Southeast Asian countries to counter the aggression of China. So India's Indo-Pacific vision, the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative of India, aligns with ASEAN Outlook for Indo-Pacific, which means our vision aligns on the Indo-Pacific. India's vision and ASEAN's vision are exactly the same: to improve maritime cooperation, improve connectivity, to stabilize the region, achieve socio-economic development, promote economic ties. But India's goals may not be achieved if ASEAN group itself remains divided. That is the concern of the writer. If ASEAN has these fundamental differences within the group, and if members are divided on these major issues, particularly Myanmar's troubles and the China-US Cold War, on these issues, if ASEAN countries are divided, then it weakens the unity of the organization, and this affects the centrality of ASEAN for the Indo-Pacific. Is that clear? So these are the arguments made by the writer, and I feel it's a very, very important article as far as international relations are concerned. Because for India, Act East policy and the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative are major policy initiatives. This whole region is a priority area for India. So UPSC might ask a detailed mains question asking you to analyze the internal differences within ASEAN and how it affects Indian interests. Now let's move on to the next article from page number 7 that focuses on disaster risk reduction. This article is written by Kamal Kishore, the member secretary of NDMA, the National Disaster Management Authority of India, along with the special representative of the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction, who also heads the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. The UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction is responsible for implementing disaster risk reduction measures. This is the global nodal agency of the UN to focus on disaster management and disaster risk reduction. So India works closely with the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the two top officials have jointly written this article talking about the importance of disaster risk reduction and how the G20 group has taken a major initiative to promote disaster risk reduction. Under India's leadership, G20 has taken a major step to focus on disaster risk reduction. So that is the focus of the article. So let's understand what is disaster risk and how we can manage and reduce disaster risk. Let's understand this core concept, and then I'll explain the G20's initiative and its relevance. See, today, in the field of disaster management, managing disaster risk and reducing disaster risk has become a top priority as per the vision that has been laid out under the Sendai Framework for Action. The Sendai Framework for Action, which was worked out in 2015, is the global framework that is guiding the rest of the world with regard to disaster management. So under Sendai Framework, few goals and targets have been identified which are being implemented in this period between 2015 to 2030. In these 15 years, the goals and action plans of Sendai Framework are being implemented through the United Nations. Many countries like India are adopting these standards and following these measures to improve disaster management in our countries. So the central focus of Sendai Framework is disaster risk reduction. Reducing disaster risk is the central theme of the Sendai Framework for Action. Disaster risk is nothing but when hazard meets with vulnerability and exposure. When hazard, vulnerability and exposure interact, that is when disaster risk is maximum. Now let me explain this in slight detail. Now imagine this circle to represent hazard. Imagine this to represent vulnerability and this to represent exposure. Now this common region here that you can see in the image, this overlapping region where hazard, vulnerability and exposure meet, this is where disaster risk is at its maximum. Is that clear? Now what do you mean by a hazard? A hazard is a potential state or a substance or an event which has the potential to turn into a disaster. For example, an earthquake, if it occurs in a highly densely populated region where buildings have not followed the construction standards, if the buildings are not earthquake proof, that is when the hazard becomes a disaster. Only when hazard causes large scale loss of human life, large scale damage to property and infrastructure, damage to the environment, that is when a hazard becomes a disaster. Otherwise, every other natural calamity is essentially a hazard. It's a hazardous event or a state or a substance which has the potential to cause a disaster. So if the hazard meets with vulnerability and exposure, that is when the disaster risk is maximum. When I say vulnerability, it refers to the weakness of a region or a community with regard to the impact of this hazard. Is that clear? See, every region, every community will have a certain degree of resilience and resistance against the impact of a disaster. But if the community is not prepared, if the geography is not suitable in that region, or if the socio-economic and political factors are not suitable in the region, if the right measures have not been taken before the disaster, that increases vulnerability. Because such a region, such a community is not prepared to cope with the impact of the disaster. So a region which is weak in its preparedness, which hasn't planned for the upcoming disaster, is vulnerable. A region which has no early warning systems. A region where no planning and preventive steps have been implemented. A region where there is poverty, there is lack of good governance, right? Such regions are vulnerable to the higher impact of a disaster. And comes exposure. To what extent is the region exposed to the hazard? For example, the east coast of India is directly exposed to the impact of cyclones compared to interior parts of India. So if these three factors meet, if hazard, vulnerability and exposure meets, that is where disaster risk rises. Is that clear? So you can manage vulnerability and exposure. This is the very core idea of Sendai framework. See, sometimes there's nothing much we can do about the hazard, especially natural hazards. They're largely not under human control. We can't prevent cyclones from taking place. We can't prevent earthquakes or volcanoes or landslides. But through right planning, preparedness and preventive measures, we can manage vulnerability and exposure. We can increase the strength of a region to withstand the impact of a disaster. By providing for effective early warning forecasting systems and by implementing real-time alerts, you can make a vulnerable region more resilient. Through real-time alerts, you can evacuate the people on time. You can reduce the exposure of a region to a disaster by creating structural measures, by building cyclone shelters, earthquake-proof and earthquake-resistant buildings, by following regulation standards, by enforcing the building standards. So there are various measures you can take in disaster management as part of the disaster management cycle, through which you can build resilience to a region and a community to reduce vulnerability and exposure. So once you reduce vulnerability and exposure, it automatically reduces disaster risk. So this is the whole concept of disaster risk reduction, which has been championed by the Sendai framework for action. Is that clear? By managing vulnerability and exposure, by reducing vulnerability and exposure, disaster risk can also be reduced. Thus, preventing a disaster if possible, or at least mitigating the impact of a disaster. This is the central focus of Sendai framework for action. Now, India, which is heavily inspired by these goals, has already adopted the Sendai framework into the National Disaster Management Policy and Plan. The National Disaster Management Policy and Plan, which has been brought out by the National Disaster Management Authority, it is already in line with the Sendai goals and targets. So India firmly believes in implementing the Sendai framework to achieve efficiency in our disaster management cycle. In a disaster management cycle, there are three phases in disaster management. You have pre-disaster, where you focus on planning, preparation in order to prevent and mitigate the impact of a disaster. You have during disaster phase, where you try to provide effective emergency response and relief to save as many lives as possible by giving immediate assistance during a disaster. And finally, you have post-disaster phase, where you focus on long-term recovery through reconstruction, rehabilitation and rebuilding of that region which has been affected by the disaster. So to bring efficiency into the three stages of disaster management cycle, implementing the Sendai targets is extremely important, and that's exactly what India is doing. So India is focused on improving infrastructure resilience to disasters. It's a priority for India especially critical infrastructure, is highly vulnerable to the impact of disasters. Power plants, dams, airports, seaports, mobile internet connectivity, all of this constitutes critical infrastructure of a country. If critical infrastructure is damaged during disasters, it will set back the region with regard to its development by a few decades. It will destroy the economy and it will lead to social impact as well in the region. So to help the region recover quickly and bring the region back to normalcy, we have to ensure that the critical infrastructure is made disaster resilient. So India has focused on infrastructure resilience, and we have even launched a global initiative with the United Nations called the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. This is one of the major initiatives launched by the Modi government. It's also called CDRI, which is in line with the Sendai goals and targets, because it is focused on disaster risk reduction by making our infrastructure resilient to the impact of disasters. Now, India has taken one more step through the G20 to promote the concept of disaster risk reduction. As of now, India is hosting a meeting of disaster ministers from around the G20 countries. It's taking place in Chennai, and India has announced the launch of a new initiative. A G20 disaster risk reduction working group has been set up with India's leadership. A dedicated working group has been launched under the G20 to focus on disaster risk reduction. I'm sure all of you know that currently India holds the chair of G20, the presidency of G20. So in the run-up to the G20 summit, India is hosting a lot of meetings in different sectors, and disaster management is one of the priority areas for India. So under the disaster management ministers meeting, India has launched a new initiative through the G20. We have brought consensus amongst all the G20 members to launch a disaster risk reduction working group that will focus on disaster risk reduction and its adoption around the world. Now, according to the writers, this is a major step, because don't forget, G20 countries, they constitute the top 20 economies of the world. They account for 85% of the global GDP. They account for 2/3 of the global population. So if the top 20 economies are coming together to focus on disaster risk reduction, and if they have launched a joint working group, then this is a major step. This aligns with India's vision under the disaster management policy and plan. It aligns with our initiatives such as Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So that is what the writers are talking about. They are praising India's initiative, and they are saying that this G20 platform, this G20 working group, has the highest potential to promote the adoption of disaster risk reduction. Because as you know, currently the world is hit by multiple disasters quite frequently. Many experts argue that the higher frequency and intensity of disasters is a result of climate change and global warming. In the last few weeks itself, we have seen devastating floods and landslides in northern India. We are currently witnessing devastating heat waves and forest fires in southern Europe. South Korea, Colombia, US, all these countries around the world are hit by major disasters in the last few days itself. So given the impact of disasters, it's very, very important to focus on disaster risk reduction to achieve the goals of Sendai framework. So it's in that context that the G20 working group launched by India is extremely important. So if you can understand these key points and concepts, it's more than sufficient with regard to this topic. So this completes my detailed discussion of the first two columns, and now we head towards the smaller articles in today's newspaper. Let's take a look at this article on page number 1. It's a small article, but still the development is extremely important. Israel has enacted the controversial judicial reform bill. Israel's parliament has passed the controversial judicial reform bill that had led to massive protests in the country. I'm sure you would have read in newspapers that Israel has been witnessing mass protests over the last 5 to 6 months. because Israel's government was pushing through a very controversial bill to reform the judiciary. See, Israel right now has a far right-wing government in place under Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is the current prime minister. He is heading a government which is seen as a far right-wing government aligned with conservative ideologies. So this government of Benjamin Netanyahu has picked few issues with Israel's judiciary. The government's argument is that Israel's judiciary has often committed judicial overreach and entered into the domain of the executive. See, Israel is also a democracy. And as you know, in a democracy, one of the core principles is separation of powers between the key pillars like executive, legislature, and judiciary. So the argument of the Israeli government is that the judiciary has often interfered with the powers of the executive through judicial overreach. Whenever government takes few decisions, the judiciary has often overruled and overturned some of the government decisions and has even declared some decisions as null and void. If some government decisions are illegal or unconstitutional, the judiciary, through its power of judicial review, has stepped in and overturned the decisions or completely declared the decision as null and void. So the government has an issue over here, and it has alleged that the judiciary is committing overreach into the domain of the executive, and hence the government feels that the power of the judiciary should be limited. The powers of the judiciary should be curtailed with regard to overturning the decisions of the government. Along with that, the executive is giving itself a greater role in the appointment process of the judges. Is that clear? In Israel, judges to the higher judiciary are appointed through a committee that comprises of few senior judges of the Supreme Court, few representatives of the government, and few civil society representatives. So there is a committee which includes diverse sections that appoints judges in Israel, that provides a system of checks and balances. Now the government, through this amendment, is increasing its representation in this committee, thereby giving government greater control over the appointment of judges. Now this is a direct breach of the doctrine of separation of powers. One of the core tenets and basic structures of a democracy is the independence of the judiciary. If the executive is getting a greater role in the appointment of judges, that directly compromises the independence and autonomy of the judiciary. So these are the key flashpoints which have led to massive protests by pro-democracy supporters in Israel. In fact, there was one more provision as well. In Israel, the ministers, they are bound by law to take the advice of their legal advisors given through the Attorney General. It's a legally binding requirement where Israeli ministers, they have to take the advice, the legal advice given by their legal advisors, if it comes through the office of the Attorney General. Now this provision is being removed through the amendment, so that Israeli ministers are free to act on their own. They need not listen to the legal advice coming from the Attorney General. So all these changes are being made through the judicial reforms which are being introduced. The far right-wing government says these reforms are necessary to create a system of checks and balances and to protect the executive from the overreach of the judiciary. But the judiciary, the citizens don't agree with this. Majority of Israel citizens have opposed it and they have taken to the streets, leading mass protests over the last few months. Several students, activists, thinkers, they've all led mass protests. Thousands and thousands of them have assembled across Israeli cities protesting against these judicial reforms. And now the parliament has already given its nod for the judicial reform bill. Is that clear? Now the topic is relevant for India for two reasons. One, it's in the context of India-Israel relations. India-Israel are very close partners in the strategic domain especially. And in India as well, with regard to the judiciary, there is a similar dispute between the executive and the judiciary. Quite often the government of India accuses the judiciary of judicial overreach, where the judiciary is stepping into the domain of the executive. With regard to appointment of judges, in India we have the collegium system, where judges appoint themselves to the collegium system. Government has no role in the appointment of judges, right? It merely follows the recommendations given by the collegium. So there has been a tussle between India's executive and judiciary as well, quite similar to the ongoing dispute between Israel's government and its judiciary. So this could have some parallels. If not India getting inspired by the same changes, at least there are some parallels. There is a comparison here. Let's say in polity there is a question on judicial overreach or collegium system. You can draw a comparison regarding what has happened in Israel, how judicial reforms have been introduced and how this is criticized as a anti-democratic move. Because this erodes democracy. If government is giving itself the power to appoint judges and if it is limiting the power of the judiciary to overrule government decisions, then essentially the independence of judiciary is being compromised and it's an anti-democratic move. That is why the pro-democracy protesters have opposed these changes and taken to the streets to protest against Israeli government actions. Alright, so please be aware of the development. You don't have to dive into the details, just the development, the concerns here and how it applies for India, how it is relevant for India. This is more than sufficient. So now, let's take a look at the prelims section. Let's look at this article on page number 5, which refers to another upcoming mission of ISRO. ISRO is all set to launch PSLV C56 in a few days, which will carry Singapore's new imaging satellite known as DSSAR. Along with that, 6 other small satellites will be launched as part of a commercial launch which ISRO is carrying out. So from this article, there are some important points that we can take away which is relevant for our prelims. As you know, ISRO has become a global leader in the commercial launch segment. Especially ISRO's PSLV rocket has become a reliable launch vehicle that offers cost-effective, reliable launch options. Compared to other space agencies around the world, ISRO offers one of the cheapest and most reliable and effective launch options. That's why many other countries and universities around the world, many companies as well around the world, they rely on ISRO to launch their smaller satellites into low Earth orbits. So this satellite, the DSSAR, it's a project of the government of Singapore along with a private company, and it's essentially an imaging satellite. The main payload it carries is synthetic aperture radar, which is also important for your prelims. See, imaging satellites and Earth observation satellites, if they carry optical instruments, they have a limitation. Because optical instruments or optical cameras, they can't capture high resolution images during night time and also when there is cloud cover. So optical cameras are good enough only during daytime. But if there is cloud cover and during night time, during dark, optical cameras are ineffective in capturing high resolution images. This is where synthetic aperture radar comes in. Synthetic aperture radar is capable of capturing very high resolution pictures, very high resolution images, even during the night and even when there is cloud cover. So synthetic aperture radar is very effective in Earth imaging satellites. This serves not just a civilian purpose but also a military application. For example, India also has few satellites with synthetic aperture radar payload. They serve a military purpose. They help in surveillance. They help in keeping a check on your borders, tracking enemy movement, checking infiltration, keeping a check on the maritime space, etc. Right? So Israel has worked with ISRO before in developing synthetic aperture radar technology. India and Israel have jointly launched similar satellites under the RISAT series. So now Singapore is launching its own version of synthetic aperture radar payload through the DSSAR satellite, which India is launching through PSLV C56. This launch will only use the core. The core of the PSLV will be deployed to place DSSAR satellite into a near equatorial orbit, and along with that 6 other small satellites will also be placed into low Earth orbits. Now these commercial launches of ISRO is handled by Antrix Corporation, the commercial arm of ISRO. Antrix Corporation has always handled these commercial launches for private space agencies and other space vendors, and this fetches revenue to India. It fetches foreign exchange to India, and ISRO has established a credible track record with regard to successfully launching foreign satellites for a price. So ISRO is already capitalizing on the space launch market. Got it? So there are some key points you can take away from here which is relevant for your prelims. Then moving on to the last article on page number 12, we have an article that refers to the Cheetah Translocation Project, which is a very ambitious environmental conservation initiative that has been pushed by the Modi government. Just a few months back, Prime Minister Modi inaugurated the program. The government has invested a lot of money and effort into this important conservation initiative to bring cheetahs back into India's wild. As you know, cheetahs went extinct in India. They were driven to extinction primarily due to hunting, loss of habitat, and domestication. So now India is making an attempt to bring African cheetahs and translocate them into India. So India signed deals with Namibia and South Africa. And from these African countries which have excess number of African cheetahs, India procured 20 cheetahs and they were translocated to the Kuno National Park in Madhya Pradesh. Is that clear? India took a lot of measures to ensure their safety, their well-being. All the health checks were done. They were quarantined for some time. They were slowly released from a captive habitat into the wild. Officials kept a close watch on them using CCTV cameras, camera traps, and also by using radio collars, where collars were attached to the neck of the cheetahs, which would help in tracking their movement. So officials can keep a watch on the cheetahs to ensure their well-being and protection. But unfortunately, in the last few weeks, 8 cheetahs have died in succession. In quick succession, 8 cheetahs out of 20 have lost their lives. And a lot of concerns have come up about the efficacy of the project itself and the viability of the project. In fact, many experts had pointed out these concerns even before the project was launched. See, one, African cheetahs adapting to Indian subcontinent in itself was a challenge. Plus the question of space, right? The possible chances of man-animal conflict and the conflict of cheetahs with other big cats like tigers, leopards, etc. was always a concern. Availability of prey was also a concern. And also the heat conditions in central India was also a major concern. Apart from this, the risk of diseases. So India was quite confident that we could successfully execute the project. Of course, some losses were expected. We never expected all the cheetahs to survive. It's a long-term plan to create a survivable population of cheetahs. Of course, these losses are bound to happen. But what has happened in the last few weeks is of concern because apparently, according to reports, some of the deaths have occurred because of the poor radio collars which were fitted onto the cheetahs. According to reports, these outdated radio collars which were strapped onto the cheetahs, which was made of polymer and metal-based material, it led to very serious infection and a maggot infestation, thus resulting in a serious wound from which the cheetahs could never recover. According to reports, at least 2 cheetahs have died because of the poor radio collars that have been used. It has led to an infection around the neck of the cheetah, causing a maggot infestation, and this eventually has contributed to the death. But the government is denying these reports. The government has denied it. The government has said the cheetahs have died due to natural causes. But experts are pointing out with available pictures and evidence that these deaths are likely occurring because of the poor radio collars which have been used. So because of the concerns, the officials have removed radio collars of 6 cheetahs, saying that they should carry out further examination. They haven't given an official reason. They haven't attributed the deaths to radio collars yet. But because of the concerns, they have removed the radio collars of 6 cheetahs, saying that they require a health examination. That is why we have removed them. So please understand why radio collars are used. Radio collars are used to track animals which are kept under close watch from the forest officials. Essentially, it catches onto a radio frequency which helps in tracking the movement of the animal. So instead of radio collars, there are more advanced and simple technologies available. There are GPS based trackers through a bionic chip, and the chip can be inserted into the skin of the animal, right? Many domesticated pets like dogs are mandated to have such trackable chips. So this is a more efficient technology, but India has relied on radio collars, which according to experts is quite outdated, right? So that is why there is a controversy over the translocation of cheetahs project, and we need to see how the project will go ahead. So this completes my detailed discussion of today's The Hindu newspaper. I hope you guys have understood all the articles. Please take up these questions. It's based on what we have already discussed. So make use of the discussion and try and write an answer to these questions and post them in the answer writing portal. And the link for that, you can find it in the description box. So I hope you guys have liked the session. Do let me know how it went in the comments. Subscribe to the channel and do press that like button. So that is it from my side. Thanks for watching. I'll see you tomorrow. Till then, take care. Have a good day.